Good evening, everybody. Come one, come all, and welcome to Get Into It with Safir. I am your host, which is probably painfully obvious, but I'm glad that you joined us today for this impactful discussion where we're going to unpack the topic, facing off with COVID-19, are schools better prepared for students? Today, of course, I have the privilege of hosting three amazing guests who are all well respected in their field of work. They each bring a different perspective to today's topic, but are all excellently equipped and prepared to tackle the tough topic of school preparedness in the face of this pandemic. First up, of course, I have with us Kaleena Berryman. She is the Executive Director of Abbott Leadership Institute at Rutgers University and is stationed in Newark, New Jersey. I have with me second, Julie Borst, who is the Executive Director of Save Our Schools, New Jersey. And my last guest is Jennifer Castaneda. She is a registered nurse and a BSN, clinical therapist, author, a nursing educator, and mental health educator. So with these three special guests, I will ask them to join me on the screen so you can all get to know them as well as I have. Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for joining.
Hello. Hi, Sophia.
Hello. Thank you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, what better way than to jump right into it? We are all here to get into it, so why not do that right away? So, Kaleena, I'm going to start with you.
Yes.
We all obviously find ourselves in unprecedented times. And as we spoke moments before the broadcast, we know that term is highly and sorely overused, and yet it still scratches the surface of what we're really facing as communities. And so, beginning with you, recently in local news, New Jersey's Hillside Public Schools Superintendent Robert Gregory announced an enhancement of their partnership with an organization called Stepping Stones. Now, Stepping Stones is a provider of quality childcare to families of students who would either need full or partial day care, while also enabling students to learn remotely and attend school through virtual means, and it allows parents to actually go to work. So in your opinion, and that's definitely a great initiative, but it's something that I think that we should see more of. So in your opinion, what prevents larger inner city districts like Trenton or Camden or even locally in Newark from adopting such a model to ensure safety while also eliminating the divide between childcare and education?
Oh, Safia Jenkins. So the first problem is that we have an incorrigible leader at the national level who is unmoving, who has been and exhibited poor leadership throughout this pandemic. And he put the focus early on around getting back to school.
Yes.
And he put the withholding of national federal funding on that agenda. And so that's at the very top. And so it made governors and it made school leaders have to put the attention on going back to school. And that's where the attention was. And all of us were sitting around saying, nobody's going back to school.
Right.
So now everyone else is starting to catch up with the reality that we are not going back to school until we can be certain that our children and our teachers and our educators will be safe. America is not the type of country that's willing to put people in danger, and especially children. And so now we have a lot of school districts deciding not to open their doors, but they've spent weeks planning to.
Right.
And so they've spent 95% of their brain power planning for the reopening and 5% planning for virtual. And so now there's a shift to try to, I don't even know if the shift really has been made, but there is a dire need to think about what we're going to do to empower parents and families and caregivers to be able to operate with their children virtually. And very little attention has been paid to that. And so I'm glad that Hillside superintendent is thinking that way. And everyone should have been thinking that way. But because the national leader put the attention on opening our doors, that is where the attention was. So even the governor, that's where the attention was. And it is scary because once again, I kind of had more hope that parent empowerment and engagement would take center stage as a result of COVID-19. But unfortunately, once again, it was a backseat. And so are we better prepared? As a parent, I can say I'm better prepared because I better prepared myself. But there have been very little efforts from school entities to make sure that we're ready for this challenge.
Yeah, and you raise a very excellent point. I mean, when you talk about leadership at even the top levels of government, where the focus is inappropriately placed in places that really should take a back seat to child safety, to family safety, and really to mitigating the risk that already exists with the spread of this virus. But now it leads me to another question, because your answer was very enlightening. It certainly was well informed, and I appreciate you for that. But it also highlights what I perceive as an issue. While entities and LREs or local education bodies were planning for returning to school, and some eventually changing and shifting that idea to now say we're going to begin with remote learning. How important to you do you think it would have been to have appropriate parent engagement and involvement in the COVID response planning efforts?
Parent leadership, especially in the COVID. If I was a school leader or a district leader, I would have had a whole, forget inviting parents to the table. Parents would have had a whole table, so that we can figure out how to do this. And so, I understand that school leaders had really heavy responsibility. I can't imagine being a superintendent at this time and having to think about the safety of janitorial staff and ordering all the proper equipment, and how are you going to prepare teachers to operate both virtual and remote. I think that I cannot put it to the fault of superintendents or of principals that they didn't do a better job. But what I can say is that, and when we talk about what we're going to do moving forward, if we had citywide parent leadership bodies in place pre-COVID-19, then whenever there was a challenge, we could bring that leadership body together. But because there really isn't a citywide strong leadership body, and not just made up of people you want to hear from, but parents who are going to challenge you and tell you the truth, who are respected leaders in the community, who do the work every day. If we had that citywide parent organization in partnership with the district, then we could be prepared for anything. And so I think it's about time that parents had their own table, and that they be given the same information that school leaders are given, and that it's we really put more investment in that, because now the success of this school year, probably at least a third of it, is once again in the hand of parents. And we know that parents need more support, and a body of parents could have laid out a plan that would have set us up for success and not for the possibility of failure. So, it's sad, but I'm hoping at some point we can start to think that way.
Absolutely. Well, that leads me to a final question for you, and then I'm going to transition over to our next panelist for a brief moment. But if you had the opportunity to rewrite the dictionary, how would you define parent engagement?
I would call it parent empowerment. I would treat parents with the same level of partnership as I would treat the mayor, or I would treat the governor or an educator. Parents should be at every single table that education conversations are happening. There should be no level that is too big for parents. Parents have to be empowered and given opportunities to grow their skill and grow their understanding, which is what we do at ALI. We develop parents who understand education policy, who understand the regulations and the guidelines that are behind decisions we make. Parents should have data information at their hand. We should know happening. And I think, there's just an idea that has to change about the capacity of parents, in particular Black and brown parents, in particular parents who live in cities like North and Jersey City. I mean, I'm a parent leader at my son's school, and when I originally began advocacy efforts there, I was treated just like all parents are treated, and I'm the leader of an organization that teaches parent advocacy. So they learned today, but it shouldn't have to be that way. And so at some point, we have to see parent voice as value added and not as something that is there to only do damage or challenge. Right. And challenge is a good thing. And so, for me, it's parent empowerment where parents are educated, engaged, and empowered to be a part of and lead in every single process that happens in our schools.
Absolutely. And that's quite similar to some of the work I do with leadership development or leader development. And in the course of developing leaders, you always come back to the point that it's best to surround yourselves with those who will challenge you.
Yes.
So that you then become greater or your work becomes more effective. Absolutely. And so regardless of the role, regardless of the office that is held, it is important that you have those challenges in order to be successful. Mm-hmm. And when we're talking about the impact of children's lives and their education, and really what that means is the state of our economy, our society in some years down the road, then that investment has to include those types of challenges. It's not something we can take lightly. Mm-hmm. So, Julie, I want to turn to you for a moment. As a parent representative of a school safety team some years back, you're also a strong supporter of public education, seen both in your personal life as well as in the work that you do.
Right.
You've had to have learned a lot about the obstacles that students face in public schools and how the impact of COVID-19 has disproportionately hurt Black and brown and typically poorer students.
Right.
So how can public schools address adequately the technology gap and the low rates of network accessibility for students of lower economic status?
Right. So you've hit actually on several things there. And I think, as we were talking before the broadcast began, these were impediments before COVID-19. And they're not new by any stretch. They have been known quantities for a very long time. And now there is this rush to try to fill in those gaps. So I think, the fact that we don't have a solid number out of the New Jersey Department of Education of how many students don't have either a device or access to the internet is a bit of an impediment, because we can't talk about this intelligently. Either it's 89,000 or it's 220,000 students. That's a really big difference right there. Also, I would say that, we know that Chromebooks are on back order for many months, so that even if districts were able to use their CARES funds money to order devices, they won't be in until at least October. I'm hearing from other parts of the country that it's even later than that. And as far as the infrastructure goes, just being able to connect to a reliable internet is obviously an issue. Hotspots are fine to some degree, but they're not always reliable. There is a bill right now that's been introduced, that would create a statewide network for internet access, and there would basically be two tiers of it. And the first tier would be free, and the second tier to get, a broader bandwidth or faster service, you would pay for. But at least that would give everybody access. And obviously that's going to be years out, because you're talking about a major infrastructure project. In the meantime, districts have gotten very creative about how to get their students online where they can. School buses have been used in neighborhoods with hotspots in them. I'd also like to point out that this is a time where, libraries have been closed, and those have been great access points for students, including students who are in college in our community colleges. The students use their libraries there, and having those closed has caused further distress. So it's not just the K-12 system that we're talking about in terms of a digital divide. I'm very heartened to hear, Senator Ruiz has been a champion to try to close that divide. The governor has stepped up with CARES money and is getting philanthropy dollars also. But again, it's now a hardware issue where you can't even get the devices. So this is obviously going to take time. And as school is starting in September, whether your district has decided to go back into the building or whether they've gone full virtual, we know that there are students who are not going to be connected at home. And unfortunately, that is our reality right now. It is going to take time and more money to resolve.
Absolutely. Your work has also put you in places or positions where parent engagement is paramount. More importantly, your organization's principles at Save Our Schools, New Jersey, include the belief that publicly funded schools should be democratically controlled and accountable to their local community, thereby ensuring no undue segregation and or discrimination and providing full transparency.
Right.
So with that said, and this is similar to the question I asked of Kaleena, how can communities and families ensure accountability under restrictive conditions of distance learning and poor or missing parent engagement or effective communication?
Right. That's a challenge everywhere. That I imagine that's happening in every zip code in this state. And so my personal belief is very similar to Kaleena's in that, parent empowerment is incredibly important. And that involves several things, including a willingness of parents to step up and to speak up. And sometimes you do have to say things that nobody in the room wants to hear. It also includes, though, finding those positive things and making sure that, everybody in your community is aware of those things. And the other thing I will say, because I do spend a fair amount of time talking with superintendents around the state, that on that side, it really takes good, strong leadership in either your superintendent, hopefully, and certainly also in your building principals. And these are people who are dedicated to growing themselves. And so therefore they are not afraid of having input that's something other than themselves or their circle of people either within the district or within their peer group of other superintendents. Those places are much more successful in finding cooperation within their community because they are dedicated to communicating what is going on. That trust is huge. If you don't have that trust, then you're going to be spinning your wheels. They are, and you are. I will also say too, obviously Save Our Schools New Jersey, we very much believe in democratically run schools, and that includes having democratically elected school boards. That is paramount to us. But we also know too, just having watched the races in the last few years, school boards are supposed to be nonpartisan, and they're supposed to be that for a reason. This is a public good. Public education is a public good. Everybody should have access to it, and everybody should be able to participate to the extent that they want to. That happens through your democratically elected school board. The Republican Party and the Democrat Party need to butt out. And I'm sure that's very unpopular when this thing gets out. They're going to say, oh my God, Julie said. But yeah, they need to butt out. Like this is for parents. These are for the people who are utilizing those services at that time. Does that mean that an older person who doesn't have children in the system any longer can't be on a board? Of course not. And in a lot of cases, they can provide some really great perspective and give you history that you might not have. But these are the people who should be there making those decisions. And as parents or as former parents with students in a district, those people provide a perspective that you're not necessarily going to get from a superintendent who's going to be more concerned in the day-to-day running of the place, right?
Absolutely.
You got to have that person. And I can think, like 3 or 4 faces pop up when I think about this. There are some superintendents who do this brilliantly well. And I know that they try to share what they learn. Nobody's hoarding information. They're making sure that their public knows. They are listening with the intent of listening and not just responding. And those things are really important.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, you raise a great point. You talk about how the Democratic and Republican parties should butt out. But I have the same sentiment when it comes to lobbying efforts. I just don't think that in general, money and politics should be cohabitating. But more importantly, it certainly shouldn't be a factor when it comes to school board elections and the like.
Right, I agree. Yep.
That democratically run school board from the vantage point that it's truly representative of the people and the voices of those families is of utmost importance to me. So I appreciate you saying that as well. So we're going to turn to you in a moment, Jennifer. So prepare yourself. But I do have one final question for you as we're on this segment, Julie. And that is, I'll start by just giving a few stats. Nationally, an astounding 35% of students who dropped out in the 2015 and 16 school year had an emotional disturbance or other health impaired classification. And that's an astounding number when you think about
awful, yeah,
their representation of the overall population.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but meanwhile, and this only adds fury to the flame that already exists that is within special education, especially in the face of COVID-19.
Mm-hmm.
An astounding 85% of youth that were behind bars that same year have a disability.
Mm-hmm. Right.
In some schools, it's commonplace that these students are segregated and are under-supported in overcrowded or overcoming trauma and stressors.
Mm-hmm.
It's unfortunately part of the problem that feeds into the school to prison pipeline.
Yes.
So what, in your opinion, are some of the ways that the inequities that adversely impact students who are receiving special education, as well as those impacting students of color? And how can progressive changes that bring counselors into schools instead of cops help to improve outcomes for these students?
Right. So we could probably talk for a couple of hours about this. But you are right. Those stats are troubling and unfortunately also not new. So I will put on my New Jersey Community Schools Coalition hat here, and just say that if we're going to be serious about closing off the school to prison pipeline, that at the very least every Title I school in New Jersey needs to be a community school. And by that, I mean that local schools become the hub of their neighborhoods. A community school provides a framework within which services can be brought to bear. Systems can be put in place according to the needs of the students who are in the building at that moment. So in other words, and this is another one of our big words here, is flexibility. This requires a superintendent and a board of ed who knows how to be flexible and nimble. You may create the most amazing community school one year, and 4 years later, you have a completely different population whose needs are different, and you're going to have to be able to adjust to that. The key component, I think, to a community school is a site coordinator, and it is that person's job to find out what it is that building needs and the families of those students need, and hopefully even to the larger community, and bring those services to bear for those people. That is going to make a huge difference for those students. So the ones who get, moved out of school because they're a behavior issue, there's always a reason for the behavior. If you're not finding out what the root cause of that is, and you're just essentially discarding that student, you've done an incredible disservice, not only to that student, but to society at large. Communities go a long way to help addressing those things, because it just creates this framework where you can bring in all of these different pieces that you need. And this is not something necessarily that a family is going to be equipped for a million different reasons to go find on their own. Yeah. And if you can do this in a safe place inside of a school building, or in the case of this, where school buildings may be closed, that doesn't mean a site coordinator isn't still doing that work, right? They're still making sure that people are fed. They're still making sure that people have access to healthcare and mental health care that they need. right? They're making sure that when the hotspot goes bad, they're running out and they're making sure that that's replaced immediately. Like, those are the things that they're doing. Right now, our superintendents are playing that role on top of doing their job.
Right.
So I think those are really big, solid steps that can be taken to start to address these things.
Yeah, one of the other things that comes to mind when we begin to explore how to address some of these issues that plague these communities. Yes, community schools is a tremendous help. That certainly would help to overcome some of those challenges that put so many people in such a vulnerable place because they don't have access to those additional services that can be brought into the school building. It's also important to note, though, that New Jersey, statistically speaking, still sits at one of the top positions of the most segregated school systems in the country.
Absolutely.
And so we also have to consider how an effective and sustainable integration model would help and how to implement that in ways that would benefit all students, especially those who have faced inequities for such a long period of time that equity is such a foreign concept, they don't even know where to begin. So these are some of the things that certainly must be considered as we move forward in addressing some of the pre-COVID, pre-existing conditions that have plagued our communities.
Right. If I can just say very quickly, so you've touched on something. So the thing that we also have to remember is, while everybody likes to say that education is the great equalizer, by itself it is not. You have to have public policy that addresses all of those external things that impact a child before they even step into a school building. If you don't have affordable housing, if you don't have access to healthcare, if you don't have access to job training, if you don't have access to workforce development, all of those things play a role into what happens to a child inside of a building. And it's not always easy to talk about. I mean, a lot of public policy people they either don't get it or they ignore it. And I think we're at a point now, COVID-19 has shone a light on these inequities that we've all been talking about forever. And for the people who've been sort of ignoring it, it's much harder to ignore this now. And so hopefully something good comes out of that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I would love to echo the sentiment that you just left us with, that by itself, education is not the great equalizer. Accessibility, opportunity, equity, and moreover, justice.
Yes.
Educational
Very
justice, social justice. Those are the means by which equality is won. So I wanted to echo that sentiment. I appreciate your input and feedback there. Jennifer, I want to turn to you. I know you've waited a bit and you are now prepared to give us all that has consumed your thoughts for this past hour. As we continue the discussion about the conditions of schools in New Jersey's cities pre-COVID, I want to turn to you about some of the health and safety issues that have disproportionately impacted students of color and those of lower economic status in the state. One such story, in fact, was reported in December 2018 by Chalkbeat, and they reported that a gentleman by the name of Abdullah Sewell went to great lengths to keep his son safe. His son suffered from asthma, and he would stop at nothing to try and keep him alive. So he even got a job at the school in case he needed to treat his son urgently, so that while during attacks, he was nearby to treat him. Unfortunately, that simply was not enough. He died at home in December 2016, his son. But then Abdullah continued working at the school. And if it wasn't hard enough that his son passed away, in May of last year, his son's close friend died of the very same condition. Now, asthma-related deaths in general are usually low rates among children. But in Newark, we find that asthma-related deaths are 4 times the national average. And asthma-related hospitalizations are 30 times the national average. So even if asthma doesn't begin in school, the impact of poor ventilation and crumbling school buildings could be undeniable. At a board meeting in January, a district official was cited as saying that leaks in 9 school buildings in Newark Public Schools were likely responsible for indoor air quality issues due to mold. And worse yet, the state only approved funding for 11 of the 150 submitted capital projects by Newark Public Schools in 2016. Now, these capital projects we were in dire need for these capital projects to be completed because of the dilapidated buildings, the poor air quality, and the conditions that worsen asthma if it already exists. So my question to you, Jennifer, as a health professional, how can inner city districts like Newark prepare an effective response to COVID-19 when securing funds to improve air quality and fixing a roof was already too difficult to do because of what was made available by the federal and state government?
That's it. That's your question. That's easy. I got your answer right there. Man, I gotta agree with Kaleena when she said that what Julie and Kaleena said have a part in this answer, because when you're focused on reopening schools instead of the quality of what's actually happening in this moment, you bypass all those issues that you're going to run into. Instead of looking at making things better at an already rundown system, and you just overshadow everything else, and you're going to run into consequences. It's bound to happen. It's not like if it'll happen. It's just when another case like that will happen again. And so that's one part. So if we were to look at this as COVID, what's happening in Newark, what's happening all over in New Jersey, it's a microscope, right? It's like it just put a microscope on really what's happening in our society with inequality of health, right? Inequality of income, of Black and brown families having, 60% of income of whites. That's according to a 2016 census. So for every $100,000 that whites make, Black and brown families are making $50,000. So when you have that kind of difference in income, when you have health disparities where people aren't getting the right or equal health care, you're going to run into those issues. We already are before COVID, right? Like you said, the asthma has nothing to do with COVID. Now you have a respiratory issue coming in that's going to compound any asthma, any respiratory issues, where I don't think we're taking care of, and I think you agree that we're not taking care of what's going to happen, of the inevitable. So instead of rushing in, you're saying, how would they fix that? I would say, first, we don't rush into open things, right? And they're finding that out by themselves. Because if you look at what's happening around the states that have opened up, one state quarantined their students the first day, 120 students, Indiana, back at home. Another state, 800 students back at home. So now you're disrupting what happens with those parents. Now suddenly have to get out of work, suddenly have to change everything because we rushed into it. So it's already happening in different states. So let's look at that. Let's look at the thing, it's interesting what you said before about parent empowerment, right? Parent engagement of this man not having any other resources or feeling like he had nothing else left but to go do this for himself. And that's unfortunate because we're putting those parents and feeling in that position that they're going to have to take care of their kids. Because on one part I do agree with that, because we can't rely on society fully, but at the same time, shouldn't we be able to rely on society to help us, which is why we have to work together. So let's get the experts there, right? To see, how do we fix this? What are the right amounts? How much time will it take? Let's spend the quality that we have to be able to make something better, a system better, instead of going in and we're going to run into more problems. I'm gonna give you an example. Like even now, let's say someone quarantines. Let's say someone has symptoms at a school. What are they gonna do with that student until the parent gets there?
Right.
Are they gonna stick with a nurse? Is a nurse gonna have an N95? Are they trained? Do they know what to do?
And that's a perfect example. That's a perfect example because I was doing some research on the topic, and I wanted to see what type of response practices districts were employing as part of their strategy to reopen. In Milburn, one of the most affluent districts in our state, they have, as part of their reopening plan, procedures to respond to students who are found to be have contracted COVID-19. They have a designated area in the nurse's office set up much like an emergency room where that student would be quarantined until they could be picked up by their parents. Those types of efforts, obviously, while seemingly easier for a district that has a lot of money and a bigger budget, is certainly something that could be set as a gold standard. That should be best practice that is shared throughout all of these districts. But part of the challenge, as you mentioned, is that we have to have the right people at the table. We have to have parents engaged. We have to have health professionals engaged. The reopening task force or reopening committee of any district should encompass all of the right voices to make sure that every risk is mitigated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with you. And to do that, it's like we're almost setting us up for failure almost, because it's the second, like what happens, flu season is going to be here, right? Flu season's coming up. And what's going to happen then? How will people even know the difference between COVID symptoms and flu symptoms? And do you want to take that risk? And then obviously we don't have the money for everyone to get tested, because there's about 1 million students that would technically be going back to school if things would open. New Jersey's not able to handle that. We're barely doing 20,000 tests a day. So 1 million students before September isn't something that's feasible if we're going to do that. But then now what happens when people are coming down with cold symptoms, flu symptoms? We don't know the difference unless they're tested. Or unfortunately, unless they get very, very sick. And so those are things where any parent who's taking their kids to school has to know that there is a risk. If your school system is saying, no, don't worry, we got this, we know what we're doing, it's not. It's definitely at a risk that we're sending our kids back to school.
Yeah, absolutely. And if we can't guarantee that those risks are mitigated, obviously, in my opinion, my child's life is not worth the experiment. So it's not
right. So right now, I just want to add, because I know a lot of parents that they're listening. Right now, districts have to abide by about 40 guidelines before they're able to open up. If they can't abide by those 40 guidelines, which is how they're going to handle recess, cafeteria time, meals can't be like they were before, where they used to get up and serve themselves meals. They can't do that anymore. Things like extracurricular activities. Are they going to wash their hands? How often are they going to wash their hands? And if they're not able to do certain, like the ventilation system, like you're talking about, even the ventilation system has to be adequate, especially in the winter, because now all the windows are going to be closed come winter time. So if they're not able to, then they can't open, according to New Jersey policies. And they have to put a date for when they are going to fix those.
So that's of great concern to me. I'm glad that you brought that up, because I was going to go into that topic and for a moment was going to opt not to because of sake of time. However, I think there's a lot to talk about there. In a recent article, again by Chalkbeat on August 16th, Pat Wall writes that teachers expressed alarm by comments from leadership about, or during a question and answer session, and they were told that they would be partly responsible for cleaning efforts of their classrooms. And as if that weren't challenging enough, they were also told that for those who were worried about poor ventilation, that they needed to be very, very patient. Now, for the same reasons that I just expressed before about funding getting denied when it came to those capital projects, it still is a stark reminder that the conditions that pre-existed COVID-19 still remain. And if those cannot be addressed, how can we ensure student safety? What dangers can poor ventilation present during COVID-19 if schools were to reopen?
So if the poor ventilation continues, it can cause the allergy effect in the lungs prematurely. Like it can, even someone who isn't probably, like for me, I don't have asthma, but if I'm in a place with poor ventilation or with mold, even a normal and healthy lung will still respond adversely to it. I can still start coughing. I can still produce symptoms. And now maybe I'm coughing and I'm now putting it on someone else without it. And someone who does have, let's just say, because with COVID, you can have COVID and not have symptoms, right? So let's say you have a student that is tested, we don't know that he's tested, but he's just walking around positive. Poor ventilation system is definitely going to it's going to make everything more contagious as well. And let's do COVID. What about the flu? What about the cold? All of it will aggravate it. It's no doubt about that. Even in your own home, when you're not well ventilated, you feel like you're almost suffocating. It's just, and now you're going to wear masks on top of non-ventilated places.
Yeah. There's no question about it that COVID-19 has worsened issues, especially for communities who already suffered income inequality, certainly less accessibility and opportunity. So Kaleena, what do you have to add when it comes to these conditions and how, as a community, overcoming that, one is already challenging enough pre-COVID, and how districts can respond post-COVID to really try and bridge the gap?
Well, so I think one thing is that I think all of us need to put our focus on the biggest problem. And the biggest problem is that we are trying to operate and plan for an illness that we don't understand. And that is the issue here, because if it were the flu, my son, I'm a preemie mom of a micro preemie. And so I've done this already. My son's first 2 years, there's a cold called RSV that is as detrimental to a preemie as COVID is to the rest of the world. So when we were discharged from the hospital, we were told that there is a shot that you get monthly, that the baby gets monthly to keep him safe from RSV. We were told to try our best to limit our exposure to people for the first 2 years of life, the first 2 winters. And we were given instruction about how to make our homes safe for our children. And my son didn't get sick for 2 years. Why? Because they understood RSV. And so even though it was a threat, they had a treatment for it to help build his protection against it. And they told me exactly how it was transmitted, and they understood why it was more detrimental for preemies. COVID-19, we do not have anything that protects us from it. We don't understand how it operates. We don't understand why in April our hospitals were flooded with patients, and right now there are very few. While people may have COVID, our hospitals are not as overrun. We don't really know how it transmits. And so all of that is why we can't open schools and why parents don't feel safe. And we don't understand it because we have a national leader who has not made it a priority to understand it. So I'm not trying to turn this into a political thing, but if we ever want to get back to normal, we need to get that particular leader out of office so that we have a leader who is going to get us out of quarantine. All right, so that's number one. Number two is we have to do that because we need to open schools. As honest as the disparities are, I know for a fact that I have young people in my YMS program who are falling behind tremendously. They are not logging into virtual school. They have lost the support of teachers. They have lost the support of us. We would feed students at YMS. We have a college success center that provides internet so they can do their papers. We have a lot of different support systems that kept them moving forward. And my fear is that this is now going to be going into a year that we were unable to move those students forward in spite of the challenges that they face.
Yeah.
So I understand the need to open schools, but we have to get it. We can't open schools until we understand COVID. And so I just wanted to add to Julie's point about community schools. I think that a lot of the time that we should spend now while we're virtual is planned for how we're going to address the issue of being able to meet more of the needs that I meet at Rutgers for my students within the school building. So, I just feel like the biggest issue is just that we don't understand COVID. And until we do, we're going to be in our house talking virtually like we are.
Yeah, very, very good point. And, that type of understanding certainly requires that, again, we invite all of the right people to the table. We definitely have to adhere to the guidance issued by the CDC. But of course, as the facts continue to unfold, our ability to respond is all going to be predicated on how well we do understand what we've learned. So you are absolutely right. And like other districts, here in Newark, plans were to reopen in part with in-person learning in buildings.
Right.
And 3 days ago, we heard that the superintendent announced in Newark, as well as in a few other districts, that schools would reopen virtually only. Now, working in a corporation, we all know that giving 2 weeks notice for resignation is usually a difficult thing to transition work from one person to another.
Right.
But given 3 weeks notice, and obviously with a lot of it out of the control of local individuals because of our lack of understanding of the virus itself, how to effectively prepare, and with the ever-changing guidance that we continue to receive at the highest levels of government.
Yeah, and then also, Safia, there's a lack of understanding of how virtual learning went. What's the data on how many students have signed on in our city and who did? What's the data on how many students were able to maintain their GPA or how many fell behind? We don't know anything. And that's the scary thing. I think that the urgency on opening schools is because school leaders know that kids are getting lost. And as a school leader, that would keep me up at night. And so I commend Superintendent Leon for trying, I really do. I commend Superintendent Leon for trying his best to get our buildings open because I know he knows that a lot of our kids are in trouble right now.
Yeah, there's also the aspect of that conversation where parents were in dire need to get back to the workplace. And in some cases, that's not something that they don't have a job where they can perform those tasks remotely. Right. Many of us are fortunate that those opportunities exist, but that's not something that's widely seen in communities largely of color. Right. It's disproportionate impact of COVID-19, the way that those disparities have fallen on local communities like Newark. It's going to be important that we get the right type of investment and or funding from the highest levels of government, but that we also begin to examine the issues that existed pre-COVID that have now been further exposed because of it. And that's what's going to lead into our next segment of the conversation. There's a pandemic response model or a disaster recovery model. It is one that is evidence-based, but it's called Build Back Better. And the way that intersects with education is that, one, it's not new. It does allow for disaster recovery, but it also encompasses the requirement that we take an honest look at the pre-disaster conditions with a laser sharp focus, and we can examine the issues of equity, both in economy and in psychosocial needs, to ensure that the needs of the hardest hit families are met and any potential further disadvantage is mitigated. One of the areas is that we are required to broaden technology access, eliminate the technology gaps. I did a little bit of research, and it shows that a basic laptop costs just $200, and that's often less than one textbook for one student for one class per semester. And so what that tells me is that a move to digitize the books that students would be required to read for classes would actually save school districts money. So why do you think that school districts are still operating in the dark ages? And this is not any one school district, it's commonplace that unlike colleges, we don't offer online education in the same manner. or online literature? And how can this become an attainable goal and a real possibility for us?
So if I can, I'd like to start by addressing that. So there are a couple of things. So one of the things that a lot of people learned this time around is that virtual learning is not the same as face-to-face. But we also know that reading on a digital platform, whether it's your PC, your laptop, your tablet, your phone, your Kindle, that you do not actually retain information the same way or as efficiently as you do when you're reading it from a book with a piece of paper, and there's a whole tactile component to that. So that may be part of it. You're right, certainly the costs are outrageous, especially at the college level. Textbooks, I mean, I'm clearly the oldest one in the room by quite a lot, but even when I was in college in the 80s, my most expensive textbooks were $100 or a little bit more than that, and now that's really a commonplace sort of thing. So they are cost prohibitive. But I think that that's also money that's well spent. I think part of our broader problem, if we're going to go back pre-COVID and talk about kind of how we got here and why these things are so much worse during these few months, is because the money has not been put into the system. New Jersey alone has, during the last administration, was down over $9 billion. That's an incredible amount of money that didn't go into the system. The reason why only 11 capital projects in Newark got taken care of was because we haven't bonded the SDA in over 10 years. So we're not putting the money in. And by the way, that's by court order. We're required to do that, and it's not happening. Education Law Center spends a great deal of time reminding everybody of their responsibility. So if we're going to really talk about this, money in school matters. That is not up for debate. That is a fact. And if you are depriving school districts of money, and while in New Jersey it's mostly an urban problem, in other places, and still a little bit in New Jersey too, rural areas suffer from the same sort of lack of access and lack of funding. And it's really, really important to get everybody connected in that way. But I would be one of the last stalwarts to say, yeah, you got to have a book. The book, really, having the physical thing with you really does make a difference. It is much easier to study and go back and look things up in a book than it is to do this online, even for the kids who are growing up in a digital world, my daughter being one of those. She does much better with a physical book as well. There was a little study that was done to try this out. I want to say it was at the Naval Academy. So you're talking about the best and the brightest of all of us. Highly motivated students, and they gave half the class a book, or actually they were taking notes. So they were taking notes on a computer, half the class, the other half did it on a piece of paper, and then they took a test. The people who had the paper and pencil just blew the doors off of the people with the computer. And the reason is how you're processing the information as it's coming at you. The same thing when you're reading from a book. There you go. I know, I carry around one of those too. Here's mine. So, everybody kind of makes fun of me because I'm the one in the room usually who's not a baby boomer by 9 months, and other computers, and I'm here with a piece of paper. But I think that's part of it. But I think overall, I mean, we really do have a very serious conversation about how it is that we're funding our schools. Yeah. So if the state is not able to provide money into a district, then the rest of that has to be made up locally. And if you live in a place where your local tax revenue is very high, you're going to be able to have more money to spend in schools for all kinds of things, not only the physical plant, but for all the things that happen in wealthier districts that don't happen in poorer districts. And if you're in the district where you don't have that local revenue and it cannot be raised, then the state needs to step in and fill in that gap. If we're going to be honest about how it is that we are going to make sure that all of society gets lifted together, that has to happen. And that has not been happening.
Yeah. And one of the other ways, at least an impact can be made there goes back to some of that sustainable integration as well. historical redlining activities and
Absolutely.
other legal activities that created this divide
Right.
and segregation of housing has bled into the education system because
Definitely not an accident.
we don't have, and because we can't fund the school system in many districts locally, it leaves you with that gap that if it's not filled by the government, means that the most vulnerable among us are impacted the most.
Right. Right. And I'd also say too, because as long as we have a nurse in the room with us, one of the things about, having school districts put together these plans, they're all supposed to have that separate room, right? But not every building in this state has a nurse.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's really basic, right? There's no nurse. Who's gonna fulfill that role?
Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think too that I want to add, Julie, to what you're saying is, it seems separate, but it's similar. Is we're saying pre-COVID, by like going to doctor's visits, right? Like these students and parents possibly getting more sick, needing to go. Pre-COVID, you have to make doctor's appointments. You got to go to visit your doctor. After COVID, everything became telehealth. Now suddenly it's easier to see a doctor within a week or see a doctor the same day. So hopefully those are things that will continue, that we've now realized can work, where you can see someone face to face. I mean through the virtual, and then get a prescription at your pharmacy and get taken care of.
Yeah, telehealth has been a lifesaver, believe me.
It has, but my hope though for like that bill that I was talking about earlier, that's talking about creating a statewide network infrastructure for internet, is that healthcare companies will get on board with that, because that helps with the telehealth and the telemed visits and all that kind of stuff too. I mean, there's lots of different reasons to have that.
Absolutely.
It won't happen fast enough for this particular issue, but for long term, that really is how we should go.
Yeah.
So there's a question on the broadcast. One of our viewers has left it in the chat, and I'm going to post it here and ask all of you. I'll start with, any one of you who wants to jump in, I'll allow you to do so. But the question reads, why did Governor Murphy offer extended care aid to certain counties, but not Essex County, where some of the hardest hit communities exist? Ultimately, the hardest hit school districts. I don't know if any of you is intimately aware of that issue, and so I'm going to open up the floor for that answer.
Hi, Frankie. And no, I don't know the answer. I wasn't aware that CARES money was specifically going. So my understanding, and I'm not quite sure which round Frankie's referring to, but initially the CARES funds that came to New Jersey to go to schools was based on your Title I students. So districts got different amounts of money based on how many Title I students they had. I want to say there were only 40 or 41 districts that didn't get any money out of that.
I know Mayor Morocco was saying that the initial CARES Act money actually didn't come to Newark. It went to the county, and they had to apply to the county for funds.
Okay.
So it went to the county, but then the county distributed aid to the districts. And I think Frankie is referring to, I believe it was an announcement today about additional CARES Act funds that would go. I'm not sure why it wasn't given to Essex. Possibly maybe Essex got a larger amount in the beginning and they used the additional to help some of those who received less. But that's a really good question, Frankie, and I'm sure someone on this call will find the answer. So
Absolutely. And we'll post it later in the comments of this broadcast. So come back and you'll see that, and we'll tag you in that response.
Yeah.
But thank you very much, Frankie. We appreciate the question and engagement. So as part of the Build Back Better model, we talked about how thinking about with laser focus the inequities or the conditions that pre-existed COVID-19 will help us to build a better platform for education when we return. And so under that model, there's also the mandate that we begin to individualize instruction. As you all know, students with IEPs receive individualized education. It's a proven model. Certainly, if the IEP is followed, you can address the individual needs of that student. Well, the suggestion under Build Back Better is to carry some of that into general education so that students are receiving individualized care and attention. The question for any of you who would like to jump in is, how can districts who perhaps are already strapped for cash even entertain this type of idea if it ends up needing more monies coming from their budget?
Right. So this idea that you basically create IEPs for general ed students, that idea has been around for a long time. As a former special ed advocate and a special ed mom, I would say no, for a couple of reasons, because you kind of run up against IDEA there on the special ed side. But on the gen ed side, this is really what a teacher does, right? A big part of a teacher's job is to find out where their students are and figure out how they best learn and teach accordingly. So I think we have to remember that the teacher component in this is really important. That teacher training is really important. That professional development for teachers is really important. But I think that's what gets you there. That's really what their role is and should be, and that's certainly how they're trained. In the environment that we find ourselves in these days, which is highly standardized, with state standards, and those are sort of artificial. So when people are talking about their child being behind, this is what they're talking about. It's up against those state standards, which are artificially created. So what exactly does behind mean? But really, we don't use teachers when everybody's concerned about hitting marks about artificial standards. That's what they have to be focused on, not necessarily how their students learn or where their student actually is. It makes it harder. So I'm not saying that teachers don't do that anyway, but it makes it harder for them to do that. I think we have to allow teachers to do what they're created to do. I mean, this is what their profession is. I don't think everybody needs an IEP. I think kids who need IEPs and don't have them, that's a problem. And we have to be really honest about how it is that we're finding those children and making sure they get the services they need everywhere.
Yeah, absolutely. And that in itself is an injustice and is criminal
right.
for those students who are in need.
We can talk about that for hours too.
Yes, absolutely. As a father of a son who has autism, as well as a member of a local special education advocacy group, this is a phenomenon, or really an issue that surfaces quite often, and certainly not something I would advocate for everyone to get an IEP. But individualizing education to an extent where, as you just stated, a teacher's ability to differentiate education and identify where students are currently and what pathways might be needed for them to acquire success and positive outcomes. In my opinion, and just like you also mentioned, that can only be achieved when we allow teachers to truly focus on teaching. You're an educator and your primary role is to educate. But teaching to a test is certainly a blocker for that issue.
Absolutely.
Standardized testing unnecessarily and relying so heavily on those scores diminishes the impact that a teacher can truly have in that area. And so that for me is of utmost importance as well.
Yeah, Safir, I think that I do to some extent believe in individualized planning, but more so that every young person in middle school should have a secondary plan, which they begin to develop around 6th grade to make sure that they are prepared for their high school experience, whatever that choice may be. And that when students are in high school, they should have a post-secondary plan. And that would mean more guidance counselors. There is a need for us to really individually look at the trajectory of a young person's life and make sure that they have access to the opportunities that are in alignment with their dreams. And a lot of times, that kind of attention only happens to the children at the top, and the children that are in the middle don't get that kind of attention. So I don't advocate that every single child should have a plan for every single year, but I do believe that we went through the process of planning for secondary and then planning for post-secondary, it would set up a lot more students for success. But I think what's more important is what Julie was talking about, and that's community schools. So if there are community schools, it's easier to think about a plan for a young person because you have the solution in the building. So for instance, my son's school is in Jersey City. It's called A. Harry Moore. It's not advertised as a community school, but it is. He receives all of his therapy in school. There's also a clinic for his wheelchair and all of his different devices. Children Specialized comes to the school. The dentist comes to the school. His diet, one of the best physiatrists in the state, Dr. Diamond, comes to the school. And so if I'm a teacher and I see that I have a student who can really benefit from a particular service and the services in the building, then I'm more likely to say, hey, you know what? This student could really use this. Let's get them involved in this. It makes it a little bit harder for a teacher to see a need and not be sure how to fill it. And so I think that when we are saying that there's an urgency around community schools, there really is. And as we build back better, if we could put some more attention on that, even if there were not necessarily every service within a particular building, but at least within a neighborhood, different schools had different services, and there was type of a cross use of those services, then our children would be a lot better off. I'm a mother with a lot of access, with great health insurance, with a very flexible job. But when I tell you having those services in my son's school have definitely improved the quality of his life, that's just a fact. And so, I would say if we focus on the community schools first, I think it'll be a lot easier for individualized planning to happen.
Absolutely. It certainly would serve as a platform from which to jump and lift the trajectory so that we can really make an impact there. One of the most critical components of this Build Back Better model to me is really the idea that when we come back, we should be prepared to make trauma-informed practices the norm. Trauma-informed and trauma-responsive care should be made available to every student, especially those who have been most severely impacted by even COVID-19. I mean, we're talking about the already existing traumas that really ravaged our community, now being further exacerbated because we have less socialization for young students, and especially those who are receiving special education, have less interaction with educators and peers. And so that isolation certainly takes a toll on even adults. And of course, it's going to take a toll on students. So in what ways now or in the near future can districts begin to employ trauma-informed care and really commission the studies necessary to make sure it's done the right way?
I'll share with, first of all, trauma-informed care, right? My definition of it, because it's so important even in nursing and in mental health, is that every interaction you have with someone, you're assuming that they've had some trauma, and that any kind of response you may have to them, or how you have a conversation, how you educate, how you say anything, can actually make that trauma better. Like they can recover from it and heal, or even if it has nothing to do with the trauma, or the way you respond makes it worse for them, and hinders it and impacts them or recharges them again. So knowing that is something that the teachers and people who are doing that kind of connection, we need to be educated on, first of all, on what that even looks like. Because like you said, we're going through it now. Even as adults, we're going through it. Look at birthday parties, right? How birthday parties are now. You go around in a birthday caravan, no one stops. It's just, even that is so different. And thinking about when kids go to school now, all these rules, don't touch them, don't go there, don't do this, don't do that, play over here, play over there. That's gonna, for lack of better, clinical words, gonna mess with your mind and how you interact with yourself and how you interact with other people. And then it can influence their schoolwork. So being trauma informed is going to be more critical than ever. And teaching I think one of the first places is going to be teaching the parents that this is something, that this is a thing, like it matters how we talk to them, and the teachers as well, and teaching them what this looks like and what it, like just saying, hey, go over there, like sharp directions can traumatize someone, because we don't even know what's going on with them at home now. And we're not even talking about students that are in households that are abusive. We're just even regular, healthy, you are loved at home and supported, and now you come to school and now it's like bam, bam, here, this, all this difference. It can affect our psyche and our emotional wellness.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, you made a great point, about the need to have a presumption of a need already existing.
Yes.
When we're interacting with students and children, assuming that there is a need already puts us in an appropriate mindset where we're looking for cues or we're looking and exploring for opportunities to actually help that student. So that certainly was a great point that you brought up there. It looks like, Kaleena, you have something to add. So I'm going to...
Me too.
Well, not much. I was just going to say that Safia and Julie, we all are part of organizations that are very much, we hold schools accountable, but we're also about parent advocacy building and building the capacity of parents to make sure that their children have what they need. And so I think it's going to be important for us to also say that parents, you are the ones who are with your children every single day right now. You see how they are responding to this. I had a young person, we've been doing YFS virtually, and she hasn't said much of a word. Whenever she does log on, she didn't say much of anything. But on the last day, I asked everyone, how was their experience? And she went on a 30-minute rant about how horrible virtual was for her. And she said, you want me to sign on and my bed and my TV are right there? Why would I want to do that? This girl said nothing. She said, and she just let it all out. And I was glad that she could do that. And so one thing I think that we all have to do is provide space for young people to think about this and analyze it and talk about it. Parents, we got to see what's going on with our children. We have to figure out what we can do to mitigate some of that damage. And what can we do to make sure that they feel that they're socializing in some way, that they are feeling connected to their peers in some way. It's in our lap right now. And so, while we want schools to do what they're supposed to do, parents, we're going to have to really, as we also look at the academic part, also look at the social and emotional part of it, set our kids up as best as we can for success, and then get with your PTA and advocate for what you believe students need. This is the time to raise your voices and fight. It's not the time to be silent, to say, look, before we come back to school, here is what must be in place. And organize parents to be able to have one voice. Before a part of your plan, I'm glad that you put up the plexiglass, and I'm glad that you have brought a lot of hand sanitizer, but what are we going to do about the mental health of our young people? And a part of your plan has to be this, and this. Parents, you can do that. You can win that for your children. So, we're everybody on this call is a parent advocate, an advocate for children, a fighter. So we got to put a little bit of that in there too.
Right.
Absolutely.
If I can just add to that just very quickly. So there's organizations here in the state that work towards that, and one of them in particular is SEL4NJ. Mm-hmm. They have an agreement with a company called Pure Edge that does mindfulness, awareness, and is all about healing. One of the things that we've been talking about, obviously everybody is very concerned about students and what their experiences have been. I don't think there's anybody who doesn't recognize that everybody has experienced some level of trauma during this time. And that for teachers, they need to be recognizing and taking care of themselves before they can take care of a student. And I know that there are superintendents who have been providing professional development to their teachers all around this, specifically because we know that anybody who walks through the building or through their computer, that they are experiencing trauma Okay, so either it's happening to themselves where you might have a really social kid and you're not able to be social. That's a devastating experience. We're also turning on the news and we're seeing, just the craziness of the world, and it's relentless. So I'd also say to parents, like, really limit the amount of time that your children have access to that. But I think overall there is a general understanding that everybody needs to take the time to heal. Like the first day of school should not be trying to figure out where you are academically. It should be that check-in to find out where you are and how you're doing and how you feel about what's happening to you, if you're in a place where you're ready to articulate that, right? And part of trauma-informed care is understanding and being able to navigate that and guide people through those experiences. And there are lots of great resources in the state. Even the Department of Education has really great resources for that as well. And they're part of SCL4NJ too. So I think, that there is this recognition of that. I also want to say too that I know that there are some superintendents who put together basically like a parent university. For a lot of parents, this technology is all very new, or they're not familiar with whatever the school is using, whatever platform the school is using. They're trying to help parents, put them in a position where they can help their children. So those things are happening. I know NJEA has been working on parent-focused webinars to help them navigate those things and to help parents, kind of feel empowered to say, okay, you've done enough today, because there are some children who just will keep at something for hours and hours and hours, and that's not necessarily a good thing. So they want to, empower parents to understand the basics of being a teacher, so they can help their children best. So if these things aren't already out, they are coming with the aim of helping parents be much more empowered.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So as we get ready to close, there is something that Frankie said, and of course I'm going to share. Frankie's been very engaged in the conversation, and we are grateful. He indicated mindfulness, cognitive behavior therapy, and wellness recovery action planning, or WRAP, for children would be key to incorporate into curriculum during and post COVID-19 for trauma-informed care. And he's absolutely right. These are the same types of practices that are used in recovery coaching, as well as in other areas of emotional and mental health services. So to me, there's an imperative that we begin to bring this into education, because this is more preventative in nature. As an adult, a lot of what we're dealing with is responsive. And if we can respond sooner or prevent altogether, it certainly positions us to build back better. What say you?
Definitely. I love this topic because, like you were talking about pre-COVID, right? So again, putting a microscope on what was already happening before. We're a society where we're very reactive, way before COVID, and our stress levels are so elevated. We all have some sort of PTSD, and 1 in 4 people have some sort of trauma, and trauma isn't always some big thing where, it has to be something where people often think it has to be something like rape or you were murdered, which is terrible. Like, you were assaulted. Trauma can be something like you're neglected, like you're not listened to. It can look like you're yelled at. It could look at you don't feel loved. And so we're ready. We have a lot of that before COVID. So the fact that now we're looking at these things to put it into place is great. And maybe this is something that I hate to say needed to happen, but something that happened, and nevertheless now it's here to be able to put these things into place. CBT, looking at your thoughts. And I gotta say, I love what Julie said. The first thing that's part of trauma-informed care is not saying, hey, what are your goals for school this year? It's how you feeling about what's happening?
Right.
What are your thoughts about what's happening? And do teachers know to do that? Or do teachers maybe some teachers may want to act like we're fine and we got to move forward and we can't think about this and we can't talk about this. Some teachers may have a good heart and think that. And that's something that's where we come in and educate about this. So I thank Frankie for sharing that. So true. Did we lose Shafir?
I'm here. It actually worked out perfectly. Thanks so much for sharing that. You did lose me, but I'm glad to see that everyone else was still here and able to continue in my absence. I know we're in good hands, so it's okay. So really quickly, as we prepare to transition toward the conclusion of today's broadcast, again, I want to thank all of you for your time and for all that you already are doing, and of course, what you are committed to doing so that we build back better. I would love for this conversation to go beyond the parameters of this broadcast, and perhaps we'll all just re-engage, put our thinking caps on, and put together some initiatives that we can push together. So I'd love to do that. If you're open to that, I will certainly see to it that we begin to engage in that way. But really quickly, as we prepare to close, there's always a question that I ask of everyone. The question differs, but I always finish with one question for everybody. And so I'm going to start in the same order that we all appear on the flyer. So I'm going to start with you, Kaleena, and then we'll move over to you, Julie, and then ultimately Jennifer. And that question is, in the midst of COVID-19 and perhaps with the looming housing crisis we're going to face, folks have not yet been evicted, but that is a very real threat to the survival of families. Also with the wealth gap that exists in this country and particularly in the state of New Jersey, and the wide sweeping segregation that we see. And of course, I've given you a lot to preface my question. The question is for you. What do you believe is the most important priority that school districts have to have today? And I'm starting with you.
If school districts would put parents at the forefront of figuring out how we move forward. See, here's the thing, you know, at ALI, I am in a position to work with parents such as you and your wife all the time. So I don't make many moves without you because I understand that you all make me better. And if I was going to say what is the first thing that needs to happen in this city, and regardless of what the issue is, put the residents and the parents who are brilliant, who understand the issues, who are the experts in the issues, put the students at the forefront. If you start there, give them access to information, give them access to funds, give them access to development opportunities, then all of those other issues will begin to subside because you are empowering the people who need to be empowered most. And they're going to have the ideas. I've always seen parents who, when there's something suggested, a reform model or initiative suggested, they'll say from the beginning, that's not going to work. And sure enough, and we've now wasted $3 million on this thing. So if I had to pick one thing, Safia, it would be put parents in the front seat, listen to them, and see them as valuable parts of the process because they are, and they have the answers. And if justice is your goal, for real, that's it. And vote.
Did we lose Sophia again?
I think that's great.
There it goes.
There it goes.
Perfect timing.
Yeah, there's a storm looming in the area. I don't know what's happening, but thank you very much, Kaleena. I'm going to turn to you, Julie, now to answer the same question. To you, from your vantage point, with all of those items that I prefaced with my long list of itemizations, what do you think? I'm
going to leave the studio. I'm sorry. I have to run. It's an urgent matter, but I had a great time, so thank you.
Great to see you, Kaleena.
Bye, Jennifer.
Thanks, Kaleena. Nice meeting you.
Thank you. Get into it with Safia Jenkins.
There you go. Wow. Well, obviously, as a parent advocate, so ditto everything Kaleena said, first and foremost. The second thing is that I really believe that student voice is incredibly important. You know, I think if we're not listening to the needs of our students, like, why are we even here? So I think that has to be done in an organized sort of way, whether that's with their parents or without them, that the student voice is really important. If we're going to talk about policy issues that are all around in our community, echo our governor here and say we really need those federal dollars. We really need to be able to step in and make sure that families are not being put out on the street, whether it's losing their lease or losing their homes. We can't allow that to happen because the trauma from that is just going to be horrendous. A side note to that, though, for anybody who does and they have to leave the district where their children have been, New Jersey is one of the few states that does have a law that does allow your child to continue in the district in which they were originally enrolled. And the state has an obligation to make sure that student continues in that district. So I just want people to keep that in mind as these things are happening. But I think the policy decisions are big ones and they are tough ones. And I don't think that New Jersey, and we're not the only state guilty of this, but New Jersey has not done a great job of, having a budget that's centered people who need the most, help. And we need to start doing that.
Thank you so much. And Jennifer, I'm coming to you. Same question.
Yeah, and thanks, Julie. And Kaleena also gave great answers. I agree with the fact of the students having a voice of what's really going on, of being educated and what's going on around them. Also, like Kaleena said, the parents. At the end of the day, I think, because we're what makes politics, where people is what make the politics. The politician is a person and they're making the policy and they're making decisions. And sometimes those decisions can get really hard on what to do. And it may look like it's too much, or it might look like there's only one way to get this because the problem seems so big because it's been happening for so many years, decades. It didn't just happen now. And so I would say one of the things that are necessary is for self-reflection and self-inventory of the politician, of the people, of the parents, of what is it that of a community, what is it that I'm looking for? What is it that I want to stand for? What is it that I want to leave behind? What are my values here? Because that is what's going to keep you up fighting, coming up with new ways, figuring it out, not letting it go, not hushing things on the side, not hurrying things up when they're not supposed to. Like I think Julie said it earlier, speaking up when saying the things you don't want to say, and those come from within. And so for an important piece is for that to really come back. People come back to what they really value and what is the quality that they want to be part of their history as they put their footprints out here, as they put their hands into what's happening and that affects so many people, and not to hide behind just what's the next step. I think that's going to be an important piece.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. Thank you, Julie. And of course to you as well, Kaleena. Thank you all very much for joining on today. This is certainly a timely discussion. We are in unprecedented times. And as communities, as parents, as leaders, as professionals, and as partners in policymaking and in education, we have to begin to do things in an unprecedented way as we respond to this crisis. And so that's keeping our children at the center of every decision that we make, keeping families engaged throughout that process, identifying and addressing the mental health challenges, and of course the emotional, as well as the social and emotional learning that needs to be employed so that we can address the traumas that our students are facing, are all paramount to how we respond to this pandemic. Thank you all who joined on Facebook and on YouTube and on IGTV. I am glad that you joined us today to get into it with Safir. Join us again in 2 weeks, where we'll be discussing the topic, Getting Real, about reparations. You are a valued guest of mine. You always have space here. And when you have a topic of great importance, you might want to guarantee that you can get into it with Safir. Thank you all so much. Have a wonderful night. I bid you all adieu. And on that note, I'm out.
Thanks, Saphir. Bye.
Bye.